Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something truly revolting. Not castles or knights, but a side of medieval life so horrendous that most people didn't survive it. You're about to find out why being a medieval dentist was an absolutely disgusting career choice and how it's nothing like dentistry nowadays. So before you get cozy, go ahead and like the video only if you actually enjoy these sleepy dives into history. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing where in the world you guys are tuning in. Now dim the lights, let the room go quiet, and get comfortable. Because tonight, you're not just going to hear about medieval dentistry, you're going to live it. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news, you still have teeth. The bad news, they hurt. Your jaw throbs with a dull, pulsing pain, the kind that feels like someone has wedged a tiny coal furnace beneath your gums. You run your tongue over your molars and taste something metallic. Blood. The medieval alarm clock, a distant church bell, clangs through the misty air, and with it comes the realization you are about to visit the dentist. Your dentist, of course, is not a dentist at all. Dentistry isn't a profession yet, it's a side hustle. The man you're going to see is also the local barber. He'll trim your beard, bleed you with leeches, and, if he's feeling confident, yank out the throbbing tooth currently ruining your life. His workshop is a dim wooden room that smells of wax, sweat and old bandages. On his table are tools that look like they belong in a blacksmith's forge. Iron pliers, bone saws and metal hooks. The forceps are so rusty you wonder if tetanus was invented just for this moment. The reason you're here isn't subtle. In the Middle Ages, people believed toothaches were caused by worms living inside your gums. Little creatures burrowing through the enamel, chewing through nerves, and setting up a party in your mouth. And the best way to evict a worm? Rip out the entire tooth. Logical, brutal, wrong. But it's what people believed, and belief often mattered more than fact. The barber offers a few remedies before the pliers come out. He pours you a rinse of vinegar, wine, and, if he's running low, urine. You swish it around your mouth and gag as the sour liquid burns your tongue. Congratulations, you now smell worse than the open sewer outside. If that doesn't work, he might stuff your gums with herbs, sage, mint, cloves. Chewing cloves does numb the pain a little, but it's like putting a band-aid on a decapitation. Eventually the moment arrives. You sit on a rickety stool gripping the armrests as the barber clamps his pliers around the tooth. He doesn't warn you, he doesn't count down, he just pulls, hard. The pain is blinding, white hot. You can feel the crunch of bone in your skull as your jaw is nearly wrenched out of place. Blood gushes into your throat, metallic and warm, as the barber twists and yanks like he's removing a stubborn nail from a piece of wood. If you're lucky, the tooth comes out whole. If you're unlucky, it shatters. Now he has to dig for the fragments, and if your gums still bleed afterward, out comes the hot iron. Red-hot metal pressed against your open wound, cauterizing the flesh. The hiss of burning tissue fills your ears, the smell of charred meat rising into your nose. You feel your body tense as your mouth becomes both battlefield and barbecue pit. It's horrifying, but also common. For many, this was the only cure available. The impact of a bad tooth went far beyond pain. Without the ability to chew, you risked malnutrition in a world where bread and tough meat were staples. A swollen infection in the jaw could spread to the throat, cutting off air. Some chroniclers even wrote that a toothache was deadlier than a sword wound. A wound you could see. A toothache? That was silent suffering until your face ballooned and you suffocated. And now you, clutching your bloody jaw, realise the worst part. There is no follow-up appointment, no antibiotics, no gentle dentist asking you to spit into a cup. There is only pain and the vague hope that you'll survive the week. But if you think having your teeth torn out with iron pliers is horrifying, wait until you learn what else barber-surgeons thought they were qualified to fix. You sit there holding your jaw, the iron taste of blood still strong in your mouth, but before you even had a chance to lose a tooth in the chair, chances are you already lost the battle in the kitchen. Because what people ate in the Middle Ages set their teeth on a collision course with misery long before the barber ever picked up his pliers. Bread was the cornerstone of life, but not the soft, fluffy kind you picture on a modern bakery shelf. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, and filled with more than just flour. Grain was ground between massive stone querns, which meant tiny fragments of grit ended up baked right into every loaf. Each bite was like chewing on sandpaper. Imagine taking a slice of bread that doubles as a dental file, rubbing your enamel away with every meal. By the time you reached adulthood, your teeth were already ground down, yellowed, and lined with grooves. Archaeologists examining medieval skeletons consistently find teeth worn flat, not from sugar, but from grit hidden in daily bread. And when you did get something sweet, it was not a blessing. Honey was the only common sweetener, and while it felt like a luxury, it was a sticky, cavity-loving nightmare. Sugar eventually arrived from the East, but it was an expensive import, more prized as medicine than dessert. Nobles chewed on candied fruits and syrups, their wealth literally rotting their mouths from the inside out. Dental inequality existed long before braces. Peasants had worn down molars, while the rich had blackened stumps from indulgence. The medieval diet also leaned heavily on meat, salted to last through the winter, or smoked until it was tougher than your leather boots. Chewing it required a full jaw workout, and with teeth already weakened by grit and decay, cracks and breakages were inevitable. Once a tooth split, infection followed. There were no fillings, no crowns, no root canals. A broken tooth was a countdown clock, and the finish line was either the barber's chair or the grave. Wine and ale, the standard drinks of the day, did not help matters. Water was unsafe, so people consumed alcohol constantly, even children. Ale was weak but acidic. Wine could erode enamel, and both left teeth stained and brittle. Imagine being 6 years old, sipping a mug of beer with your breakfast, and wondering why your gums bled when you chewed. It was not a moral panic, it was survival, and survival did not care about your dental hygiene. Speaking of hygiene, brushing was not a concept. At best, people rubbed their teeth with linen cloth or chewed on sticks dipped in herbs. Sage, mint and rosemary were thought to freshen the mouth, and they may have masked odour briefly, but they did nothing for bacteria. Sometimes ashes or ground salt were applied to scrape away build-up, though this often caused more harm than good, scratching enamel and leaving teeth vulnerable. A bright medieval smile was less Hollywood sparkle, and more a grim row of cracked, uneven stubs. Rotten teeth were not just a cosmetic issue, though they certainly carried social stigma. Chronic toothache could deform the face, swelling jaws until they bulged grotesquely. Pus-filled abscesses left people feverish, unable to eat, and desperate enough to seek out any cure no matter how revolting. One recommended treatment involved placing a dead frog against the cheek. The theory was that the spirit of the frog would draw out the spirit of the toothworm. Unsurprisingly, the worm remained, the frog rotted, and the patient suffered. What made this even worse was the lack of understanding of infection. A decaying tooth could trigger sepsis, a body-wide poisoning that spread quickly. In an age without antibiotics, this was often fatal. Records describe people dying from tooth sickness, which sounds almost absurd until you realise it meant suffocation, fever, and agony, all stemming from one neglected molar. Today you call a dentist to schedule a cleaning. Back then, your cleaning involved vinegar, a hot poker, and the hope that the barber had a steady hand. The stench of bad teeth was another fact of life. Chronic halitosis was so common that it rarely merited comment. In crowded marketplaces, in church pews, in smoky taverns, the air was thick with the odour of rot, sour wine, and onions. Romantic notions of medieval courtship fade quickly when you realise that leaning in for a kiss often meant inhaling the fragrance of advanced periodontal disease. Love poetry may have praised rosy cheeks and shining eyes, but no one dared write about the breath. And then there were the children. Milk teeth fell out as expected, but many youngsters never saw their adult teeth last long. Malnutrition weakened bones and gums, leaving them vulnerable. By their teens, many already suffered tooth loss, which carried through into adulthood. Skeletons of young adults often reveal gaps where teeth never made it past a few years of chewing. A smile at 20 might already look like one from an elderly person today. You feel your jaw ache again as you picture this. Not the sudden violence of the barber's forceps, but the slow, grinding erosion of daily life. Every bite of bread shaved your enamel, every gulp of ale stained your teeth, every indulgence in honey opened a cavity, and every skipped prayer that your gums would stop throbbing led you closer to the chair. Dentistry was not a separate problem. It was stitched into the very fabric of medieval survival. And yet all of this decay, infection, and stench gave rise to something else, something deeply cultural. The rotten mouth became a signpost of mortality, a visible reminder that the body was fragile and corruptible. Religious texts often described hell as a place of gnashing teeth, a vivid metaphor that resonated with people who knew firsthand how agonizing a real toothache could be. The suffering of your gums was tied to the suffering of your soul, an eternal warning that pain was both earthly and divine. You can almost hear the echo of the bell again, calling people to Mass, where they knelt together, mouths aching, breaths mingling, prayers whispered through cracked teeth. No one was spared from the rot. Rich or poor, priest or peasant, enamel gave way just the same, and behind it all waited the barber, the pliers, and the iron. But while your diet was busy grinding your teeth to dust, there was another danger lurking in the medieval world. Not the bread or the ale, but the very medical books themselves, filled with bizarre instructions and remedies that made the barber's chair seem almost reasonable. You have learned that the food itself was enough to grind your teeth down to stubs, but what made everything worse was that the very people who claimed to know medicine wrote books filled with instructions that could only make your mouth suffer more. The medieval world prized knowledge, but the knowledge available often came from manuscripts copied and recopied across centuries, filled with guesswork and borrowed superstition. If you wanted to know how to treat a toothache, you did not ask a trained professional. You flipped open a manuscript and what you found inside was a carnival of medical absurdity. One popular explanation involved the alignment of the stars. Tooth pain was thought to rise and fall depending on the movements of the planets. The moon especially was blamed for stirring up aches in the gums, as if your molar was a tidal pool responding to lunar pull. Astrology guided treatment as much as anatomy. A barber might refuse to pull your tooth if Saturn was badly positioned, warning you that it would anger the humours of the body. Imagine sitting in agony, your face swollen like a loaf of bread, only to be told to come back next week because the heavens were not in your favour. The humoral system sat at the heart of all medieval medical theory. Your body was believed to be governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A toothache was seen not as a cavity or infection, but as an imbalance of these substances. Too much phlegm might clog the head and gums, too much bile might corrode the teeth. The solution, therefore, was to purge the system. You might be bled, vomited, or purged through the bowels in order to ease the pain in your jaw. In practice, this meant that your aching tooth often earned you a dose of laxatives. Dentistry was less about your mouth, and more about turning your entire body into a medieval plumbing experiment. The remedies recorded in manuscripts were no less surreal. One recipe instructed the sufferer to burn the head of a hare, mix the ashes with vinegar, and apply the paste directly to the gums. Another recommended catching a toad, drying it, and grinding it into powder to sprinkle onto the aching tooth. Some instructions were even more theatrical. One 12th century text advised reciting a prayer over the tooth, while holding a key to your jaw, the idea being that the divine word would unlock the pain. These were not fringe cures. They were written in books copied by monks in scriptoria, treated with the same reverence as scripture itself. The worm theory of dentistry was particularly stubborn. Images survive of diagrams showing toothworms coiled like tiny snakes, living in the hollows of molars. Treatments aimed at smoking the worm out, which often meant lighting herbs like henbane or frankincense, and inhaling the fumes until you believed the creature had fled. The smoke filled your sinuses, left you dizzy, and sometimes burned the inside of your mouth. But people swore they saw small fragments expelled. It was probably crumbled bits of gum tissue or plaque, but to the medieval imagination it was proof. The worm had left, the pain had lifted, and the cure was divine. The absurdity of these texts only deepens when you consider that literacy was rare. The average person did not read them. Instead, knowledge trickled down through oral tradition. A barber in one town might repeat remedies he had heard from a passing friar, who had copied them from a text written in Salerno or Bologna a century earlier. Errors piled on top of errors until the advice became unhinged. Somewhere along the chain, a note to rinse with vinegar might become a command to gargle with animal urine, and so the practice spread, because tradition carried weight, and questioning the manuscript was as unthinkable as questioning the gospel. All of this meant that the barber's workshop was not just a place of practical pain, but of ritual. When you sat in the chair, you were not only enduring a crude surgery, you were stepping into a theatre of medical ideas that had been miscopied for centuries. Your mouth became the stage where astrology, theology, and humoral theory all collided. The hot iron was not only a tool to stop bleeding, it was the embodiment of a philosophy that saw pain as a necessary rebalancing, a proof that the humours were being restored. And of course, no manuscript was complete without a list of charms. Amulets against toothache were common, some inscribed with Latin verses, others with nonsense words believed to carry power. People tied them around their necks, wore them on belts, or even tucked them under pillows. A toothache was not simply a medical condition. It was an opportunity for magic to prove itself. The fact that no charm ever actually worked did not matter. What mattered was that you felt less alone in your suffering, armed with a string of syllables that at least gave the illusion of control. This blending of faith, fear, and fumbling science created a medieval dentistry that was less about health and more about endurance. You endured the grit in your bread, you endured the swelling in your jaw, and you endured the manuscripts that promised relief but delivered only smoke and vinegar. When archaeologists unearth skulls from the Middle Ages, they often find teeth with cavities drilled into them, attempts at treatment that left holes without fillings. These were not deliberate extractions. They were misguided efforts to cut away rot using instructions passed down from books that had no basis in anatomy. Every hole tells the story of a desperate patient, a hopeful barber, and a manuscript that encouraged both to believe in remedies that were doomed from the start. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine one of these books lying open on a wooden table, its vellum pages stained with candle soot and fingerprints. A novice barber leans over it by candlelight, mouthing the words in broken Latin and deciding tomorrow he will try mixing rabbit ashes with vinegar. He will apply it to the swollen gums of a neighbour, and when the pain does not ease, he will reach for his pliers. And so, the cycle continues. The text survives, the patient does not, and the worm remains a stubborn phantom burrowed in the medieval imagination. The manuscripts promised guidance, but the only thing they guaranteed was that the agony would never end. Each page preserved not solutions but errors, and every error left its mark on the teeth of Europe. What passed for knowledge ensured that mouths stayed rotten, gums stayed swollen, and the barber's chair never stayed empty. And as your jaw throbs in the dark, you realise the books were only half the nightmare. The real danger came when theory met practice, when these words turned into actions, and the barber's iron tools put them into motion. Your jaw aches at the memory of those strange remedies written in books, but nothing tested the limits of medieval dentistry like war. Soldiers marched into battle with rotting mouths as surely as they carried rusty swords. And on the battlefield, teeth were not just a nuisance, they were life and death. A soldier's teeth were his tools. They opened leather pouches, tore at salted meat, even helped hold nails while repairing armour. To lose a tooth was to lose part of your equipment. In fact, chroniclers described warriors who could not bite through dried bread because their molars had cracked away, leaving them hungry while their comrades chewed. This was not a small problem. A toothache on campaign could cripple a man as thoroughly as an arrow wound. When armies marched for weeks, soldiers lived on hard bread and salted meat, both of which punished the mouth. By the time they reached the battlefield, Many had jaws swollen from abscesses. Pain made men weak, distracted, and clumsy. There are accounts of soldiers abandoning posts or collapsing mid-march, not because of wounds, but because of rotting teeth. In a world where bravery was glorified, nothing seemed more humiliating than being brought low by a molar. On the field itself, teeth were often broken outright. The clash of steel helmets rattled skulls, shattering incisors. Blows to the face split jaws, leaving mouths filled with blood and loose fragments. Without modern dentistry, these injuries became permanent. Some soldiers spat out broken teeth alongside their last breath. Others lived on, mutilated smiles marking them as veterans before a word was spoken. Archaeological digs of medieval battle sites often turn up skulls with cracked jaws, evidence of both blunt trauma and the crude attempts to repair them afterward. And repairs were indeed attempted. Armies travelled with surgeons who, like barbers, carried iron tools and hot irons. Their job was not to save lives, but to patch men up enough to fight again. If a soldier complained of a rotting tooth, the surgeon might rip it out then and there with no concern for infection. There was no sterilisation, no anaesthetic, just a steady grip and brute strength. Imagine kneeling in the mud, surrounded by screams of the wounded, while a surgeon leans over you with blood on his apron and smoke on his breath, tugging at your mouth like he was hauling rope on a ship. The battlefield also created bizarre new uses for teeth. Men bit down on leather straps to endure amputations, their teeth grinding so hard that enamel cracked under the pressure. Others clenched wooden sticks, turning their molars into vices of endurance. Pain was universal, and teeth bore the brunt of it. A soldier who survived an arrow wound might come away with no usable teeth left, all shattered by the act of enduring. Tooth-related superstition also thrived among warriors. Some believed carrying a wolf's tooth in a pouch would protect them in battle, granting courage and strength. Others thought broken human teeth collected from corpses held power against enemies. Such relics were worn as charms, grim trophies that mixed war with dentistry in the most literal way. Archaeologists have unearthed pendants made from teeth, drilled and threaded on cord, evidence that these beliefs were not just rumour but practice. The social impact of bad teeth among soldiers was profound. A man who could not chew could not eat, and hunger made him a burden. Armies lived and died on efficiency, so those with chronic tooth problems risked being left behind. Chroniclers wrote of camps filled with groaning men whose jaws were swollen like melons, their comrades eyeing them with a mix of pity and frustration. You might have survived the sword, but if you could not chew the rations, you were finished. Rotten teeth also carried military consequences beyond the battlefield. Negotiations and diplomacy often involved feasting. To sit at a table with missing or blackened teeth was to show weakness. Chronic illness, poverty, and poor hygiene all carried stigma. In an age when appearance could signal power, a warrior with a mouthful of decay revealed more than he intended. His body testified to hardship, and in a world where intimidation mattered, a ruined smile was a liability. Infections spread rapidly in the close quarters of camps. Soldiers slept side by side, sharing cups, eating from the same pots, trading diseases as readily as stories. Gum infections transmitted through shared utensils, so an entire unit might develop swollen jaws in unison. Imagine marching into battle with a line of warriors all clutching their faces, more miserable from dinner than from the enemy. Bad teeth could sabotage morale as effectively as hunger or cold. Even the weapons of the time made dental misery worse. Arrows, maces and stones all carried the potential to shatter jaws. One blow could destroy a mouth, leaving a soldier not just scarred but permanently disabled. Jaws wired shut with crude straps or bound with bandages healed crooked, leaving survivors unable to eat properly for the rest of their lives. They became living examples of how war and dentistry collided, mouths permanently broken by the violence of combat. The bones left behind tell the story clearly. Skulls excavated from medieval battlefields often reveal missing teeth, fractured sockets, and half-healed abscesses. Some show evidence of multiple extractions, each tooth yanked out in desperation. Others carry holes drilled into the jaw, primitive attempts to drain infection. These were not successes. They were scars of endurance, proof that dentistry was as brutal as the war itself. Your jaw throbs again as you imagine sitting in a muddy camp, chewing stale bread with broken teeth, waiting for a surgeon with iron pliers to call your name. You realise that war in the Middle Ages was not only fought with swords and shields, it was fought with molars and gums, with every bite of bread and every cracked incisor shaping the fate of soldiers as much as steel ever did. And when the battles ended, the suffering did not. Soldiers limped home with ruined mouths, their teeth gone, their smiles permanently reshaped by war. They carried their scars into villages and towns, visible reminders of the hidden war fought inside every jaw. Yet even away from the battlefield, dentistry took on another role. It was not only about survival, it was also about appearance, because in a world obsessed with status, even rotten smiles were dressed up with cosmetics and false replacements. The soldiers may have returned home with mouths broken by war, but they did not step back into a world that accepted ruined teeth without question. Appearance carried weight in the Middle Ages, and even though most mouths were disasters, people still tried to cover the damage. The result was a curious form of medieval dentistry that had little to do with health and everything to do with vanity. Rotten teeth were not just painful, they were socially embarrassing. A smile filled with gaps marked you as aged, weak, and poor. And in a culture where status was everything, this was no small concern. The wealthy leaned into solutions that promised to restore the appearance of health, even if they did nothing for the pain. False teeth existed long before modern dentistry, but they were crude, unsettling contraptions. Animal bones, ivory, and even teeth taken from the mouths of the dead were fashioned into replacements. They did not fit well, they caused ulcers, and they often fell out mid-meal, but they provided the illusion of wholeness, which for the noble class was more valuable than chewing. The trade in teeth became a grisly little economy. Soldiers who fell in battle were stripped not only of weapons and armour, but of teeth. Grave robbers supplied molars and incisors to artisans who reshaped them into makeshift dentures. It was not unusual for a wealthy patron to flash a smile that contained a row of borrowed teeth, each one carrying the history of a stranger. Some of these dental pieces were strapped into place with wire, others wedged between surviving teeth like medieval scaffolding propping up a collapsing building. Comfort was never the point. Display was. Women, in particular, faced pressure to maintain the appearance of youth. Courtly ideals prized beauty, and though poets waxed lyrical about eyes and hair, a gaping black smile would spoil the illusion. Recipes circulated for whitening teeth, though they relied on powders of questionable safety. Crushed coral, pumice, and even ground glass were rubbed against enamel in the belief that scraping would restore brightness. In truth, these powders stripped the protective layer, leaving teeth more vulnerable to decay. Every attempt at beauty pushed the mouth closer to ruin. Bad breath was another battlefield of vanity. Chronic halitosis was rampant in a world without toothpaste, so perfumes for the mouth appeared. Cloves, cinnamon, and cardamom were chewed to mask the odour, though spices were expensive and beyond the reach of most peasants. Some gargled with vinegar infused with herbs, hoping the sour sting would freshen the mouth. Others relied on stranger remedies, like rinsing with goat's milk or even urine, which was thought to have cleansing properties. Breath may have smelled briefly different, but the rot beneath continued. Cosmetic dentistry also reflected religious attitudes. A rotten mouth could be interpreted as a sign of sin, a visible mark of corruption. Efforts to whiten or replace teeth were not merely vain but spiritual, an attempt to present oneself as less decayed in both body and soul. To sit in church with a gleaming smile, however artificial, was to project an image of health that implied moral standing. Appearance was testimony, and people were willing to endure discomfort to maintain it. The poor had fewer options, but that did not stop them from trying. Folk remedies for whitening included rubbing teeth with ashes or salt, both of which abraded enamel until it wore thin. Chewing sticks were stripped from aromatic woods and used as rudimentary brushes, though their effectiveness was minimal. Some went so far as to file teeth into more even shapes, grinding away jagged edges in a desperate attempt to look respectable. The result was often worse than the original problem, exposing nerves and accelerating decay. Archaeological finds occasionally reveal skulls with evidence of these cosmetic attempts. Teeth filed into unnatural angles, enamel thinned to a chalky finish, gaps filled with bone or ivory pegs that never fused to the jaw. They stand as reminders that vanity has always been a force strong enough to override reason. People knew the pain, but they chose to endure it for the brief illusion of beauty. This obsession with appearance even shaped court culture. Chronicles describe nobles mocked for foul breath or missing teeth, their reputations diminished despite wealth and titles. A ruler who smiled with blackened stumps was seen as vulnerable, his decayed body symbolizing a decayed rule. To counter this, rulers invested in whatever remedies they could afford, commissioning exotic spices and powders from faraway lands. Their treasuries paid for cloves and cinnamon not only for the table but for the mouth, transforming dentistry into a luxury. The irony was that the very substances meant to preserve beauty often hastened destruction. Abrasive powders eroded enamel, spices inflamed gums, false teeth scraped and ulcerated tissue. Vanity carried a heavy price, and mouths suffered under the strain of trying to look whole. Yet the cycle continued, because in the Middle Ages, much like today, the appearance of health often mattered more than health itself. You picture a noble banquet, tables groaning with meat and wine, the hall filled with laughter and candlelight. At the head of the table sits a lord, his smile a patchwork of bone, ivory and stolen teeth, his breath masked by cloves. He looks powerful, refined, untouchable. Yet behind the smile lies rot, pain, and the constant fear that his carefully constructed facade will crumble mid-feast. The illusion holds only as long as the wire stays in place. Your jaw aches as you realize that dentistry in the Middle Ages was not simply about pulling teeth or curing pain. It was about maintaining dignity in a world where dignity could be stripped away by something as small as a decayed molar. Vanity and suffering walked hand in hand, and the tools of beauty were as cruel as the tools of surgery. And while the nobles paraded their ivory smiles and the poor scraped their enamel away with salt, another force loomed larger than vanity or pain. Religion and superstition pressed their teeth into dentistry just as firmly as pliers, turning the mouth into a battleground not only of health and appearance, but of faith itself. The pressure to look presentable might have driven nobles to wear bone and ivory in their mouths, but belief in the unseen-shaped dentistry even more than vanity ever could. Religion reached into every corner of medieval life, and the agony of the teeth was no exception. If your jaw ached, you were not just in pain, you were under spiritual attack. Prayers against toothache filled medieval manuscripts, written alongside psalms and hymns. Tooth pain was seen as punishment, a mark of sin that needed cleansing. One prayer invoked Saint Apollonia, a Christian martyr whose teeth were shattered during her torture in the 3rd century. She became the patron saint of dentistry, and people whispered her name in desperate hope that she might ease their suffering. Small shrines were built in her honour, where pilgrims travelled with throbbing jaws, lighting candles and begging for relief. Even today, her image often appears holding a golden tooth in pliers, a reminder that sainthood could be born from agony. Superstition wove its way into daily practice as well. Charms against toothache were carried in pockets, etched on parchment, or worn as amulets around the neck. Some were inscribed with fragments of Latin scripture, others with nonsense syllables believed to hold power. The belief was not in the words themselves, but in their ability to ward off the spirit of pain. A rotting tooth was not just physical decay, it was spiritual intrusion, and charms were thought to lock the mouth against demons. The idea of toothworms, already terrifying on its own, was often spiritualized. Worms burrowing into enamel were imagined as agents of evil, gnawing not only at the flesh but at the soul. To drive them out, exorcisms were sometimes performed. Priests recited incantations over patients, sprinkling holy water on swollen jaws, commanding the worms to depart. Some accounts describe herbs smoked under a cloak while prayers were whispered, creating a choking haze of ritual and desperation. The worm theory may have been medical in origin, but in practice it became a battlefield for religion. Relics were another line of defence. Bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, and vials of holy water were pressed to aching jaws in hopes of transferring divine power. A toothache might send you to a church treasury rather than a barber's chair. Imagine pressing a centuries-old bone to your swollen gums, believing it could leach out infection. In some cases, relics were believed to cure instantly, though more often they simply offered comfort. The pain lingered, but the faith remained. The church also influenced how dental suffering was understood in a broader sense. Pain was viewed as redemptive, a participation in Christ's own suffering. A toothache was an opportunity for piety, a test of faith. Chronic agony could be reframed as spiritual endurance, proof that the body's corruption was less important than the soul's purity. To complain too loudly was to risk looking ungrateful for the chance to suffer nobly. In this way, countless jaws rotted in silence, their owners comforted by the idea that decay was holy. Of course, not every cure came from saints and relics. Folk superstition carried its own arsenal of remedies. One involved touching the tooth with iron at midnight, believing the metal would draw out pain. Another suggested spitting into the mouth of a frog, transferring the ache into its body. The frog usually died, and the tooth still hurt, but the ritual continued for generations. In some regions, sufferers were told to bury a nail in the earth after rubbing it against the tooth, so that the ache would sink into the ground. These practices reveal not ignorance so much as desperation. When your face swelled and burned, you tried anything, because anything was better than nothing. Toothache even infiltrated sermons. Priests used it as a metaphor for sin, warning that just as rot spreads in the mouth, so too does corruption spread in the soul if left unchecked. Medieval listeners, all too familiar with the misery of aching gums, took the lesson to heart. The pulpit echoed with dental warnings, turning personal pain into a communal image of morality. In this sense, dentistry became theology by proxy. Your jaw was not only a biological structure, it was a stage for divine judgment. You can almost imagine the mingling of ritual and pain in a small parish church. A villager kneels at the altar, clutching his swollen cheek, while the priest sprinkles holy water and mutters prayers. The air smells of incense and mildew, the candles flicker, and the man believes relief is near. Yet when he leaves the church, his gums still throb, and within days he's back at the barber's chair, the cycle of faith and iron tools continuing without end. This fusion of religion and superstition shaped dentistry far more than actual science ever did. The manuscripts offered prayers alongside remedies, and the people trusted them equally. Toothache became not only a medical condition but a spiritual drama. Every swelling, every infection, every cracked molar carried with it questions of morality, faith and fate. The barber's tools may have cut away the physical problem, but the church shaped how people understood the pain. And as your jaw pulses again in the darkness, you realize that the mouth was not just a battlefield of enamel and bone. It was also an altar, where suffering became sacred, where relics and charms hung heavy against rotting flesh, and where every groan of agony could be reframed as a hymn. Yet religion was not the only force shaping dental misery. The very streets people lived on, the cities and villages themselves, carried environments so filthy and contagious that mouths decayed simply from breathing the air. Dentistry was not confined to barbershops and churches. It was etched into the very architecture of daily life. The power of relics and charms may have offered comfort, but nothing could protect teeth from the very world people lived in. The environment of medieval Europe was an enemy all its own, and every breath, sip, and swallow brought new punishment to the mouth. Dentistry was not only shaped by barbershops and prayers, it was built into the streets themselves. Cities and towns were breeding grounds for infection. Open sewers ran down the middle of streets, carrying human waste, animal droppings, and whatever else people threw from their windows. The stench was constant, a sour cocktail of rot and decay that clung to every corner. Bacteria flourished in this environment, and mouths became reservoirs for disease. Chronic gum infections were not rare accidents. They were the natural outcome of living in a space where every step meant wading through filth. Water only made things worse. Wells in towns were often shallow and easily contaminated. A bucket drawn from the village square might contain traces of sewage, turning every sip into a slow assault on the body. Those lucky enough to drink ale or wine avoided some dangers, but even these were acidic and erosive. The very liquids meant to keep people alive worked steadily to weaken enamel and inflame gums. For children, who drank weak beer daily, early decay was nearly unavoidable. Archaeological studies of medieval cemeteries show that young skulls often display cavities and abscesses, signs that mouths were already failing long before adulthood. Rats and vermin compounded the problem. They infested homes, chewing at grain stores and leaving droppings that spread disease. Fleas carried plague, but lice and rodents spread other infections that weakened immune systems and made gums more vulnerable. A swollen jaw was not simply a matter of diet or poor hygiene. It was the outcome of living side by side with parasites that thrived in straw bedding, wooden floors, and hay-stuffed mattresses. Imagine trying to sleep while rats scurried overhead and fleas bit into your ankles, all while your molars throbbed with infection. The body never rested, and neither did the pain. The architecture of homes did not help. Small, smoky interiors with poor ventilation meant constant inhalation of soot. Hearth smoke coated teeth in layers of grime, and ash in the air dried mouths, creating the perfect conditions for bacteria to multiply. Families huddled together in one room, breathing the same smoke and sharing the same mugs. Contagion spread in whispers, and teeth absorbed the consequences. Even before cavities appeared, discoloration from soot left mouths permanently stained. Markets brought further danger. Food sold in stalls was rarely fresh, often days or weeks old. Meat hung for too long, fish spoiled quickly, and bread carried mould. Preservatives were limited to salt, smoke, or vinegar, all of which took a toll on the mouth. Salted meat cracked enamel, vinegar eroded it, and smoke left lingering toxins. Every meal was a trade between filling the stomach and sacrificing the teeth. Those with wealth could afford variety, but even noble tables did not escape the slow damage of acidic wines and heavy spices. In this environment, dental pain was not an isolated issue. It was communal. Families shared cups, chewed from the same loaves, and spread oral bacteria to one another. One child's cavity quickly became the household's collective misery. In towns, the problem scaled upward. Public wells, communal latrines, and overcrowded housing turned toothache into a civic experience. Everyone carried the stench. Everyone shared the pain. Records from medieval London note attempts to regulate waste disposal, but enforcement was laughably weak. People tossed chamber pots from windows with a casual shout, and the slurry mixed with rain to form a permanent swamp of filth. Imagine trudging through ankle-deep mud that was not entirely mud, then stepping into your home and eating bread with those same unwashed hands. Whatever grime clung to your fingers soon found its way to your gums. Brushing was a fantasy. Rinsing with clean water was a luxury. Infection was destiny. The mouth reflected all of this environmental misery. Rotten teeth became markers of the world itself, as much a symbol of medieval life as wooden shoes or wool cloaks. To look into a medieval mouth was to see the architecture of the town, the smoke of the hearth, the grit of the bread, the waste of the streets, and the failures of sanitation. Teeth told the story of the entire society, etched in enamel and bone. You imagine standing in the middle of a crowded town square. The bell tolls, the air smells of dung and smoke. Vendors shout above the din. Around you are mouths in every stage of decay, blackened stumps, swollen gums, gaps filled with bone or ivory. No one escapes. Children, merchants, monks, nobles, all bear the same signs of a world designed to punish teeth. The barber's tools may have been cruel, but the city itself was crueler still, stripping enamel and poisoning gums before the pliers ever closed. The environment even shaped the remedies people reached for. Herbs like sage and mint grew in gardens, but they could not keep up with the constant assault. Vinegar rinses were popular, not because they worked, but because vinegar was everywhere, used for cooking and preserving. People chewed sticks in the hope of scraping away rot, but the smoke in the air ensured that discoloration returned. Remedies were not cures. They were gestures against an overwhelming tide of decay. You feel your own mouth ache as you consider this. The medieval world was not neutral ground. It was hostile terrain for teeth, a battlefield where every breath, every bite and every sip pulled you closer to the barber's chair. Living itself was the disease, and dentistry was merely the symptom. And while the filth of towns gnawed at enamel, the punishments of law and justice tore into mouths in ways even more grotesque. Teeth were not only lost to bread and infection, they were also shattered deliberately, by the hands of executioners and torturers who knew the mouth was the perfect gateway to agony. The streets may have rotted mouths with their filth, but the justice system made certain that jaws suffered in ways no plague or diet could match. In the medieval world, punishment was theatre, meant not only to hurt the guilty but to terrify the crowd. Teeth, so visible and so fragile, became perfect instruments for this grim spectacle. One of the most common punishments involved the breaking of teeth as a mark of shame. Executioners used hammers, pliers, or even the blunt edge of a sword to smash the front teeth of offenders. The goal was not to kill, but to brand the mouth with visible ruin. A broken smile declared guilt as clearly as a scarlet letter. Chroniclers described thieves paraded through towns with jaws shattered, their punishment impossible to hide, every word they spoke slurred by the gaps in their mouths. Teeth were also targets during interrogation. Torturers understood that the mouth was both sensitive and accessible. Forceps were driven into gums, molars wrenched until they cracked, and hot irons pressed against lips and teeth. This was not dentistry, it was control. The agony of a tooth being pulled without cause could break even the most stubborn prisoner. Records from inquisitorial trials note confessions pouring out after a few minutes of dental torment. The worm may have been imaginary, but the pain it symbolized was very real. Tongues and jaws were often mutilated as punishments tied to speech crimes. Blasphemy, heresy, or slander could all earn mutilation of the mouth. Teeth were broken deliberately to distort voices, a permanent reminder that the tongue had crossed a line. Some offenders had teeth knocked out one by one in public squares, each crack of bone greeted with cheers or jeers from the crowd. This was not only physical pain, it was humiliation, an erasure of dignity that lingered long after the executioner's hammer fell silent. The spectacle of punishment turned the barber's tools into instruments of law. The same pliers that might have pulled a rotting molar in a workshop could be carried into a dungeon, repurposed for cruelty. The hot iron that sealed bleeding gums in surgery became the iron that burned lips in punishment. Dentistry blurred into torture, and the overlap was not accidental. Pain in the mouth was immediate, visible, and unforgettable. Even soldiers faced dental punishments within armies. Desertion, theft, or cowardice could be marked not only by flogging but by the destruction of teeth. A soldier stripped of his molars lost the ability to eat properly, weakening him permanently. Commanders used this as a way to enforce discipline, making examples of men whose ruined mouths told the rest what disobedience cost. The battlefield did not end with swords, it extended into the teeth of those unlucky enough to displease their lords. Public humiliation reached grotesque levels. Some towns enforced punishments where offenders were chained with jaws pried open, a wooden wedge forcing the mouth apart until it bled. This was displayed in marketplaces as a warning, the victim drooling and choking while neighbours looked on. The symbolism was clear. Your mouth had offended society, and now your mouth would pay. You can almost hear the echo of the crowd, the crunch of bone, the hiss of iron. These punishments were more than cruelty. They were messages carved directly into flesh. Teeth, once markers of vanity or tools of survival, became canvases for the state's authority. Every broken molar testified not only to individual guilt, but to the power of rulers who could command jaws to collapse at will. Archaeology provides the evidence. Skulls from medieval dungeons show deliberate fractures in front teeth, uneven breaks that do not match the patterns of diet or decay. Some reveal repeated trauma, as if multiple punishments were inflicted over time. These are not the marks of bread grit or battlefield accidents. They are the scars of law carried out with iron and rage. Religion sanctioned these practices as well. Punishments of the mouth were often justified as cleansing sins of speech. To curse or to blaspheme was not just a crime against man, but against God, and so the instruments of torture targeted the very place from which words emerged. A cracked smile was reframed as divine justice. To medieval eyes, the sight of a shattered mouth was proof that sin had been silenced. The absurdity lies in how often these punishments only spread more misery. A man with broken teeth faced infection, sepsis, and slow death. But the justice system rarely cared. Punishment was about the example, not survival. If you lived, you carried shame with every crooked syllable. If you died, your body reminded others of the price of disobedience. Either way, the mouth bore the mark. You feel the ache in your jaw deepen as you imagine sitting in a marketplace, a crowd pressing in, while an executioner raises a hammer to your face. No relic, no charm, no clove of spice could protect you. Dentistry was pain disguised as law, a performance that turned teeth into tools of spectacle, and once punishment ended, there was no healing. The barber might patch wounds, but the scars remained. Ruined mouths became part of the medieval landscape, visible on beggars, criminals, and soldiers alike. The line between natural decay and deliberate destruction blurred, until every broken smile carried whispers of both. But while the law shattered teeth in punishment, another force worked to preserve them in an entirely different way, not out of mercy, but out of curiosity. For the bones of the dead, teeth were treasures, harvested and traded, feeding a bizarre economy that transformed the mouths of the living into relics for the living and the dead alike. The punishments may have shattered mouths in public squares, but broken teeth did not vanish with the condemned. They lingered, collected, hoarded, and sold. In the Middle Ages, teeth became objects of trade, a strange economy where the suffering of one mouth became the solution for another. Battlefields were among the richer sources. After the clash of swords and arrows, the living scavenged not only weapons and armour, but also teeth. Soldiers stripped the dead of valuables, prying molars and incisors from jaws with knives or pliers. These grisly trophies were carried back to towns, where they were sold to barbers and artisans. A set of strong molars could be reshaped into crude dentures, wedged into gaps, or even worn as charms. The dead, in this way, donated unwillingly to the dental needs of the living. Graveyards became another source of supply. Bodies interred hastily in crowded cemeteries were sometimes exhumed, their teeth harvested under the cover of night. Chroniclers condemned the practice as sacrilege, but the trade flourished all the same. Teeth taken from corpses of the young were especially prized, believed to carry vitality and strength. To wear them was to borrow the vigour of another life, as though enamel could transfer youth like a relic. This trade did not exist on the margins alone. Nobles and wealthy patrons funded it openly, commissioning dentures or replacements made from ivory, bone, or human teeth. Artisans carved jaw pieces from walrus tusk or cow bone, then inserted human teeth where possible, creating hybrid constructions that rattled in the mouth. Comfort was not the concern, display was. The illusion of a full smile mattered more than the agony of wearing it. At banquets, nobles lifted goblets and revealed teeth that once belonged to peasants, soldiers, or thieves. The boundaries between living and dead blurred in every grin. The church played a complicated role in this economy. Relics of saints sometimes included teeth, enshrined in gold reliquaries for veneration. Pilgrims travelled to view them, praying for relief from pain. Yet at the same time, ordinary teeth stolen from corpses circulated in markets. One set inspired awe, the other disgust, but both fed the medieval fascination with enamel as something more than flesh. Teeth carried weight, whether sacred or profane. The use of animal teeth also entered the trade. Dog and pig teeth were sometimes reshaped to fill human mouths, their size and durability making them appealing substitutes. These replacements rarely fit and often led to infection, but they looked whole, which was enough for those desperate to conceal decay. Imagine chewing bread with a pig's molar jammed into your gum line, the taste of bone dust lingering on your tongue. It was not medicine, it was improvisation, and it spread misery further. Collectors emerged as another oddity. Some nobles kept teeth as curiosities, storing them in cabinets alongside shells, bones, and odd stones. To display a jar of molars was to signal wealth, as though even decay could be refined into luxury. Visitors marvelled at the sight, while servants whispered about where the teeth had come from. Every object in the jar carried a silent history of pain. You can almost picture the bustling market stalls where teeth changed hands. Amid piles of grain and fish, a small pouch of ivory white enamel passed discreetly from one trader to another. Buyers examined the pieces, checking for cracks, running fingers along jagged roots. Prices varied by condition, youth, and source. A tooth pulled from a child's jaw fetched more than one from an old man. The cruel arithmetic of value was measured not in gold alone, but in the lives whose mouths had been stripped. The absurdity lies in how little these efforts actually worked. Dentures rarely stayed in place, wired teeth cut into gums, and replacements caused infections worse than the original problem. Yet the trade continued, because the promise of appearance outweighed the certainty of pain. In a society where status mattered more than comfort, even a mouthful of stolen teeth was considered better than a mouthful of gaps. Archaeology again provides the evidence. Skulls unearthed from medieval graves sometimes reveal teeth wedged in awkwardly, their roots never fused to the jaw. Others show marks where wire once held replacements, grooves etched into surviving teeth. These were not accidents. They were deliberate efforts to reconstruct smiles, grim prosthetics that left behind permanent scars in bone. Soldiers carried this culture home as well. Veterans missing teeth from battle often replaced them with scavenged ones, taken from fallen comrades or enemies. A soldier's grin could therefore contain the enamel of both friend and foe, a mingling of lives united by violence. It was not just grotesque, it was symbolic, a reminder that war fused men together not only in blood but in bone. Your jaw aches again as you imagine biting into bread with a borrowed molar, its root never truly yours, its history unknown. Each crunch would carry the ghost of another life, the pain of another jaw. Dentistry in this form was not healing, it was recycling, a cycle of misery that turned the dead into suppliers for the living. And while the market for teeth thrived, another world of experimentation grew in parallel. For beyond relics, prosthetics, and grave robbing, medieval dentistry also dabbled in surgery, not the crude pulling of teeth, but attempts at repair. The manuscripts describe drills, cauterizations, and procedures so ambitious they bordered on reckless. The trade in teeth filled mouths with the borrowed remains of others, but some medieval minds dreamed of more ambitious solutions. Not content to rip teeth out or jam foreign ones into bleeding sockets, they experimented with ways to actually repair what rotted. This was not dentistry as you know it. It was surgery performed with fire, iron, and hope, recorded in manuscripts that blended crude anatomy with blind optimism. Drilling was one of the earliest experiments, inspired by practices far older, from ancient Egypt and Rome. Medieval practitioners tried to bore holes into decayed teeth to release pain. Tiny iron drills were twisted by hand, their tips heated to make them more effective. The goal was not to fill cavities, but to open them wider, letting out the spirits or worms believed to be inside. Patients clenched fists, groaned, and often fainted as enamel cracked under the pressure. Without anaesthetic, every twist of the drill was agony, a slow grind that vibrated through the skull. The procedure rarely worked. Instead of relief, it left pulp exposed and infection racing faster than before. Cauterization became another weapon. If gums bled or swelled, barbers reached for red-hot irons. They pressed glowing metal against flesh, searing tissue until smoke curled from the mouth. The logic was simple. Burn away the disease and seal the wound. The reality was far grimmer. The iron cooked nerves, left charred craters where gums once were, and often caused the loss of surrounding teeth. Yet for centuries this remained a go-to procedure, praised in texts as decisive and effective. To the patient it was simply unbearable. Archaeologists examining skulls sometimes find scorched marks on jaws, evidence of cauterization etched permanently into bone. Some attempted chemical surgery instead. Recipes survive describing the use of corrosive substances to dissolve decay. Sulfur, alum, and even quicklime were mixed into pastes and applied directly to cavities. The burning sensation was immediate, often stripping not only rot but healthy enamel. Gums blistered, tongues swelled, and patients gagged on fumes. But when pain dulled briefly, people believed the treatment worked. They endured chemical burns as though they were blessings, swallowing toxins that scarred their mouths long after. There were also attempts at splinting damaged jaws. Soldiers who returned from battle with broken mandibles sometimes had their mouths bound shut with linen or wire. The hope was that bone would knit together if held still. For weeks or months men lived on gruel poured through gaps in their teeth, their jaws immobilized like wooden doors nailed shut. Some healed crookedly, leaving permanent speech slurs and chewing difficulties. Others starved slowly, unable to take in enough food. These crude jaw repairs reveal the desperation to keep warriors functional, no matter the personal cost. Surgical manuals of the 12th and 13th centuries record these methods with startling confidence. Writers like Albucasis, whose texts circulated widely in Europe, described tools shaped like hooks, chisels, and forceps, each illustrated with painstaking detail. He advocated pulling loose teeth and cauterizing sockets, and his work became a foundation for generations of barbers. To read his instructions today is to glimpse a world where surgery straddled the line between healing and torture, where knowledge was real but outcomes were brutal. The deeper irony was that most of these experiments only made matters worse. Drilled teeth fractured, cauterized gums rotted, splinted jaws collapsed. Yet because patients sometimes survived, these practices were celebrated as successful. In a society where survival was already precarious, endurance counted as triumph. Pain was proof of progress, and misery masqueraded as science. You imagine lying back in a smoky chamber while a barber holds a glowing iron to your mouth. The air reeks of burnt flesh, the iron hisses as it presses into gum, and your vision darkens from shock. Around you hang tools that look like blacksmith scraps, their shapes more menacing than surgical. A bucket of water sits nearby, not to clean but to cool irons for the next round. Every moment feels less like healing, and more like ritual sacrifice, your body the altar. The impact of these experiments stretched beyond the chair. They influenced how people thought about pain. If drilling, burning, and binding were considered cures, then agony became part of treatment. Patients learned to associate relief not with comfort, but with suffering. Dentistry was reframed as endurance, a lesson in patience and obedience. In many ways, this mentality shaped the culture of medicine itself, where treatment was judged not by success but by how much a body could survive. These procedures also reveal the contradictions of medieval society. On one hand, knowledge advanced, surgical texts were copied, tools refined, ideas exchanged across Europe and the Islamic world. On the other hand, the absence of anesthesia, sanitation, and true understanding meant progress came wrapped in agony. Every improvement left behind scars, and every scar became part of the story of medicine. The bones left to us tell that story. Archaeologists have uncovered teeth drilled with small holes, jaws scarred with burns, sockets widened unnaturally by forceps. These were not accidents. They were the remains of treatments once hailed as cutting edge. Each skull becomes a reminder that medical innovation has always been shadowed by failure, and that dentistry was no exception. Your jaw throbs again as you picture these experiments. The drill grinding, the iron searing, the wire binding. Surgery in the Middle Ages was not about comfort. It was about survival measured in scars, and yet, for all its misery, it laid the groundwork for the profession itself. Every failed attempt, every botched procedure, every charred jaw contributed to the slow, painful evolution of dentistry into something more than brutality. But the experiments of surgery were not confined to barbers and scholars. They filtered into the hands of ordinary people who carried their own traditions of home remedies. The medieval household became a laboratory of desperation, where kitchens doubled as apothecaries and mouths became test sites for recipes of ash, herbs, and bizarre concoctions. The experiments of barbers and surgeons may have filled manuscripts, but most people never sat in a barber's chair. For peasants and villagers, the battlefield of dentistry was the home itself. Kitchens doubled as clinics, and remedies were passed down through families, whispered as recipes, charms, and half-remembered instructions. If your mouth throbbed at night, you did not rush to a barber. You went to the hearth, the pantry, or the garden, searching for something that might dull the pain. Salt was among the most common weapons. People rinsed their mouths with salt water, believing it cleansed wounds and drew out bad humours. Salt was cheap, plentiful, and symbolic of preservation. It was thought to dry infection as it dried meat. But too much salt burned gums raw, leaving them swollen and cracked. A mouthful of salted flesh was as much a punishment as a cure. For peasants living on salted pork and bread, the remedy simply added another layer of misery. Herbs filled the gap where salt failed. Sage, rosemary, and mint were chewed for their fragrance and mild numbing effect. Cloves, imported from distant markets, became especially prized, not only as a spice, but as a toothache cure. Wealthier households paid dearly for them, grinding the buds into pastes and stuffing them into cavities. The effect was temporary, but the association stuck. Even today, clove oil remains a dental aid, a rare medieval remedy that actually worked. Still, for most peasants, cloves were beyond reach. Their gardens offered garlic and onion instead, and both were shoved against gums in the hope that their pungent power would frighten away pain. The result was less relief than a mouth that reeked so badly no one wanted to sit nearby. Animal parts found their way into the kitchen clinic as well. Recipes instructed boiling the fat of a pig and dabbing it on gums, or grinding the jawbone of a hare into powder to sprinkle over aching teeth. Some chewed strips of leather softened in vinegar, believing the act would strengthen molars. Others rubbed ashes from burned frogs or moles into their mouths, persuaded that the smoke and residue carried purifying properties. The logic was flimsy, but when agony kept you awake through cold nights, anything seemed worth trying. Alcohol joined the arsenal too. Wine and ale, already the standard drinks of daily life, became mouthwashes. People gargled with sour wine or held strong spirits in their mouths to numb pain. The effect was brief, but the side effect was intoxication, which sometimes provided the only real escape. Chronic toothache sufferers became regular drinkers, their dental problems feeding into the wider culture of alcohol consumption. To numb your gums was to blur your mind, a trade many were happy to make, superstition remained entwined with these remedies. Charms written on scraps of parchment were tied to jaws, or prayers recited over herbs before chewing them. Some believed toothache could be transferred to animals or objects. Spitting into a hole in the ground after touching your tooth with a nail was thought to bury the pain itself. Others pressed their gums with coins, hoping wealth carried healing power. The mingling of medicine, magic, and desperation blurred every boundary. Children endured these household treatments with particular cruelty. When their teeth swelled, mothers rubbed crushed garlic into their gums or held heated cloths against their cheeks. If a tooth grew crooked, some parents tried to twist it into place with their fingers, believing they could shape the mouth as easily as clay. The attempts often left children scarred, their enamel cracked before adulthood. A child's cries echoed not only with hunger or cold, but with the sting of salt and vinegar forced into their mouths as cures. Archaeological remains confirm these home experiments. Some skeletons reveal traces of abrasions on teeth, consistent with grinding against rough powders like ash and salt. Others show evidence of partial extractions, where family members attempted to pull teeth themselves, only to break them at the root. These were not professional mistakes. They were household tragedies, recorded in bone. The social dimension of these remedies was as important as the pain itself. Neighbours shared cures, women passed recipes through generations, and households built reputations for their knowledge of dental relief. A woman skilled in herbs might be sought after, her remedies blending practical knowledge with superstition. Some became unofficial healers, straddling the line between midwife, herbalist, and dentist. Others were accused of witchcraft when their cures failed, their salt and garlic pastes transformed in the eyes of neighbours from helpful to sinister. The household clinic reveals much about medieval resilience. People endured agony not by waiting for professionals, but by experimenting with whatever the land and hearth provided. Their methods were crude, their logic tangled, but they refused to suffer in silence. Every pot, herb, and bone fragment became a potential cure. Kitchens became apothecaries, and pain was met with creativity as much as despair. You can imagine the scene. A peasant sits by a smoky fire, clutching his cheek, while his wife grinds herbs on a stone. She mixes the powder with vinegar, dabs it on his gums, and murmurs a prayer. The smell of garlic fills the room, mingling with smoke and sweat. The man grimaces, spits, and waits, hoping for relief that never comes. Around them, children watch and learn, inheriting not only recipes but the culture of endurance. The household cures did little to solve the root problem, but they kept people occupied, gave them a sense of agency, and offered the illusion of control. In a world where professional help was rare and expensive, illusion mattered almost as much as medicine. Teeth rotted all the same, but the act of trying gave people hope, and hope was often the only relief available. Your jaw throbs at the thought of these home experiments. Salt burning your gums, ashes scratching your enamel, garlic stinging your tongue. The household was not a refuge from dental misery. It was simply the front line, where the war against pain was fought with herbs, bones, and prayers. And while kitchens brewed their remedies, another front opened in the world of dentistry, one that mixed pain with entertainment. Public tooth-pulling became a spectacle, staged at fairs and festivals, where crowds cheered as barbers yanked molars from screaming mouths. Dentistry moved from home to stage, turning agony into theatre for all to see. The household may have offered garlic, vinegar, and desperation, but the marketplace offered something louder, bloodier, and far more theatrical. Dentistry left the smoky hearth and walked out into the public square, where pain became entertainment, and pulling teeth turned into a carnival act. Fairs and festivals across medieval Europe were noisy, chaotic affairs, filled with jugglers, acrobats, and merchants hawking their wares. Amid the spectacle stood tooth drawers, men who combined crude dentistry with showmanship. They wore bright costumes, carried gaudy banners, and promised miraculous cures for every ache of the jaw. To the crowd, they were not surgeons but performers, and their stage was the open air, surrounded by stalls of ale, roasted meat, and livestock. The performance began with promises. The tooth drawer boasted of his skills, waving iron pliers or hooks, sometimes gilded to look impressive. Assistants worked the crowd, collecting coins and stirring excitement. Music might play, drums might pound, and a volunteer with a swollen cheek was ushered forward. What followed was part surgery, part theatre, and entirely agony. The tooth was gripped, twisted, and wrenched free before an audience of cheering villagers. Blood sprayed, the patient screamed, and the tooth drawer raised the extracted molar aloft like a trophy. Crowds roared their approval, throwing coins or shouting prayers. The suffering of one became the entertainment of many. In some cases, patients fainted or even died from shock, but the show continued. Pain was the price of spectacle, and no refund was ever given. These public extractions were not rare curiosities. They became fixtures of festivals, woven into the rhythm of medieval life. People travelled not only to buy goods or watch games, but to have their teeth pulled before witnesses. The publicity offered reassurance. If the barber could remove a tooth before hundreds of eyes, surely his skill was real. Confidence grew from performance, not from science. The travelling nature of these tooth drawers meant they carried reputations across regions. Some became famous, their names whispered in towns as miracle workers. Others were despised, accused of causing more harm than relief. Yet both kinds thrived, because demand was endless. Toothache was universal, and desperation filled their tents wherever they went. The absurdity of these performances is heightened by the tools they used. Some carried iron forceps, but others wielded instruments designed for show rather than effectiveness. Hooks shaped like serpents, pliers adorned with carvings, even gilded hammers all appeared on stage. The instruments gleamed in sunlight, but their purpose was simple: grip, twist, and rip. The decoration masked the brutality, turning surgery into something dazzling. Alcohol fueled the spectacle as well. Patients often drank heavily before stepping on stage, numbing nerves or finding false courage. The tooth drawer encouraged it, knowing the ale both dulled resistance and made the crowd more raucous. The line between medicine and tavern entertainment blurred completely. The square rang with laughter, music, and screams, a symphony of misery disguised as festivity. Even soldiers on campaign encountered these performers. Chronicles describe fairs attached to military camps, where travelling surgeons offered their services to wounded men. Between selling charms and powders, they pulled teeth by the firelight, watched by comrades who cheered as if witnessing a tournament. The spectacle offered distraction from war, though the patients paid in agony rather than coin. The cultural impact of these public displays was enormous. Dentistry became associated not only with pain, but with showmanship. To visit a tooth drawer was to step into a world where your suffering became a communal event. Neighbours watched, children laughed, and coins exchanged hands. Relief was secondary. What mattered was that the crowd saw the tooth removed, proof that the worm had been defeated, at least for the moment. Archaeological and literary evidence alike point to these performances as common. Illustrations in manuscripts show tooth drawers gripping pliers before crowds, their victims writhing in pain. Skulls unearthed from medieval graves reveal sockets widened unnaturally, consistent with extractions performed with brute force. The scars of performance dentistry remain visible centuries later, written in bone. You picture yourself standing in the square, the smell of roasted meat and sweat thick in the air. Drums beat, a man in bright robes waves pliers, and the crowd surges forward. Someone is dragged onto the platform, their jaw swollen, their eyes wide with dread. The pliers close, the tooth snaps free, and the crowd erupts in cheers. You feel your own jaw ache in sympathy, realizing that here, dentistry was not private relief but public theatre. The travelling tooth drawers represent both the cruelty and the creativity of medieval life. They transformed agony into spectacle, blending medicine with entertainment in ways that seem unthinkable now. Yet for people who lived with constant pain, they offered something no relic or herb could provide. Proof. Proof that teeth could be removed, that agony could be confronted, and that survival, however bloody, was possible. Your jaw throbs at the thought of the crowd roaring while your tooth dangles in the air, held aloft like a trophy. The barber's chair was torture enough, but the fairground turned that torture into sport. Dentistry had become theatre, and the stage was set with pliers, blood and applause. And while fairs turned dental agony into a show, another world quietly built itself in the shadows. Universities began to study medicine more formally, compiling knowledge, debating theories, and training future physicians. Dentistry found its way into these halls, where scholars tried to make sense of worms, humours, and pain with the language of learning rather than performance. The fairground may have been a carnival of pliers and applause, but in the quiet chambers of universities another performance unfolded. Here the agony of teeth was translated into Latin manuscripts, debated under vaulted ceilings, and dissected in the language of philosophy. Dentistry was no longer just spectacle or superstition. It became a subject of learning, studied alongside astronomy, logic and theology, though rarely with better results. Medieval universities, particularly those in Bologna, Paris and Salerno, began to codify medicine into a curriculum. Students sat on wooden benches, quills scratching parchment, while masters lectured on Galen and Hippocrates. Teeth were described not as organs of chewing, but as instruments of balance within the humoral system. They were bones infused with spirit, part of the body's delicate harmony. Pain in the gums was framed as a sign of imbalance in blood, bile, or phlegm. Instead of worms, scholars wrote of vapours, of corrupted humours rising from the stomach into the jaw. It sounded elegant in Latin, but to the sufferer it changed nothing. One popular text was the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a collection of medical advice written in verse. It offered guidance for every ailment, including the teeth. Chew parsley, rinse with vinegar, balance your diet of hot and cold foods. The advice was poetic, memorable, and largely useless. Still, it circulated widely, copied by monks and carried into noble courts. To quote it made you sound learned, even if your molars still throbbed with decay. The scholarly fascination with astrology also seeped into dental theory. Students learned that extractions should only be attempted when the stars were favourable, often avoiding procedures during certain phases of the moon. Charts listed unlucky days for pulling teeth, warning of disaster if iron touched enamel at the wrong celestial moment. A peasant might not know Latin, but he would know to ask whether Saturn was in the right house before letting a barber pry open his jaw. In this way, university teaching filtered into daily life, layering superstition with academic authority. Universities also influenced the tools used in surgery. Texts preserved from Arabic medicine described instruments in detail, from hooked probes to specialized forceps. These descriptions, translated into Latin, spread across Europe. A barber in England might never meet a scholar from Bologna, but he might inherit tools designed centuries earlier in Andalusia. Knowledge travelled through manuscripts, crossing borders even when practical success did not. The result was an odd marriage of scholarly precision and everyday brutality. The contradictions grew sharper when dissections began to take hold. Although rare and often controversial, anatomical study revealed that teeth were more complex than humour suggested. Scholars noted their roots, their connection to the jaw, and their resistance to decay compared to other bones. Yet even as these observations accumulated, treatment remained the same: burn, cut, or pull. Understanding anatomy did not translate into easing pain. The university could describe a tooth with eloquence, but the barber's pliers still did the work. Soldiers often stood at the intersection of theory and practice. Campaign surgeons carried fragments of university learning into the field, mixing scholarly advice with battlefield necessity. They might consult charts before attempting an extraction, or apply herbal poultices recommended in Latin texts. Yet when a jaw swelled dangerously, they relied on brute force. In this way, universities indirectly shaped how armies treated their wounded, though not always for the better. The cultural prestige of university learning also created new absurdities. Wealthy patients demanded treatments described in scholarly texts, even when simpler remedies would have sufficed. A noble might insist on a complex mixture of herbs and minerals prepared according to Latin instructions, while peasants chewed garlic and waited. The noble still suffered, the peasant still suffered, and both ended up in the barber's chair, but the noble's misery came wrapped in the prestige of education. You can almost picture the lecture hall. Candles flicker against stone walls, the smell of wax and parchment fills the air, and a master drones on about the humours of the mouth. Students nod, scribble notes, and murmur assent. Outside in the marketplace, a tooth drawer pulls molars to cheers. Inside, in Latin, the same agony is discussed with grave seriousness. Both worlds circle the same problem. Both fail to solve it. The irony is that medieval universities preserved knowledge for the future, even as they fail their present. The manuscripts copied by monks and studied by scholars carried fragments of truth forward. Anatomy, herbal remedies, and even rudimentary surgery found their way into later centuries. The pain of the medieval patient was not eased, but the groundwork for progress was laid. Dentistry as a profession owes its existence to these slow, painful steps, even if those steps were taken across the swollen jaws of countless sufferers. Your jaw aches again at the thought of being reduced to theory, your pain described in Latin verse while your molar throbs in real time. Scholarship gave the appearance of progress, but in the end the barber still raised his pliers, the iron still hissed against your gums, and the tooth still broke free with a crunch. And while universities debated worms and humours in the abstract, armies marched across Europe spreading misery in the most practical way imaginable. Campaigns brought together hunger, filth, and disease, turning soldiers into walking lessons in dental collapse. War was not only fought with swords, it was fought with mouths that could barely chew the rations meant to keep men alive. Campaign rations were designed to keep men alive, not comfortable. Soldiers carried hardtack, a bread so dense it could last for years if kept dry. To bite into it required teeth stronger than iron nails. Chronicles describe men soaking their bread in ale or water for hours just to make it chewable. Those whose teeth were already cracked or worn down often broke them entirely, snapping molars against the unyielding crust. Archaeologists have found fragments of medieval hardtack preserved in shipwrecks, and even today it is nearly impossible to chew without risking a filling. For a medieval soldier, it was daily fare. Salted meat formed the other half of the diet. Beef or pork packed in salt barrels was tough, fibrous, and overwhelming to jaws already weakened by years of grit-filled bread. The salt inflamed gums, drawing out moisture and leaving mouths dry and tender. Imagine chewing leather straps for dinner while your gums split and bled with each bite. Yet soldiers had little choice. Hunger outweighed pain, and the army demanded discipline. You chewed, swallowed, and hoped your teeth survived another day. Ale and wine, the staples of military drink, carried their own damage. Water on campaign was rarely safe, often drawn from streams polluted by latrines and dead animals. Alcohol killed some of the germs, but it was acidic, staining enamel and eroding it over time. Soldiers drank constantly, dulling toothache with intoxication. Entire armies moved through Europe in a haze of weak beer, their jaws aching, their breath reeking, their discipline barely held together by alcohol and salt. Disease compounded the problem. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, ravaged gums, loosening teeth until they fell out in handfuls. Though most associated scurvy with sailors centuries later, land armies suffered it too when campaigns dragged on through winters without access to fresh vegetables. Soldiers developed swollen, bleeding gums, teeth that shifted in their sockets, and jaws that festered with infection. Chronicles rarely mention scurvy by name, but descriptions of men unable to chew, spitting blood, or collapsing from mouth infections paint the picture clearly. Discipline in the army rarely allowed sympathy. A soldier who could not chew his rations risked being seen as weak or useless. Commanders drove men forward regardless of pain, knowing hunger and fatigue killed as effectively as enemy blades. Soldiers too embarrassed to admit their suffering sometimes starved slowly, hiding their uneaten rations until collapse revealed them. Toothache was not only agony, it was stigma. On the march, soldiers carried tools for basic survival, but dentistry was never part of the kit. If a tooth rotted or cracked, the only option was the surgeon's forceps, or, more commonly, improvisation by comrades. Accounts describe men prying teeth from one another with knives, hammering them loose with stones, or tying cords around them and yanking with brute strength. These extractions were performed in ditches, tents, or by the side of roads, often without pause in the march. The patient screamed, the tooth broke, and infection spread in the wound. Yet there was no time for recovery. Campaigns moved relentlessly forward. Battlefield injuries made things worse. Blows to the face shattered jaws, sending teeth flying. Arrows embedded in cheeks or mouths left lasting scars. Men who survived these wounds often lost the ability to chew, their mouths permanently deformed. Some had their jaws bound shut with bandages, living on gruel until the bone healed crookedly. Others returned to villages marked forever by broken smiles, their mouths silent reminders of war's brutality. The army camp itself was a breeding ground for dental misery. Soldiers slept side by side in muddy tents, sharing food and drink, spreading infections rapidly. Communal cups and bowls passed bacteria from one jaw to another. A soldier with a festering abscess could infect half his tent within days. Gum disease spread like a silent epidemic, weakening entire companies. Armies prided themselves on discipline, but their teeth betrayed them constantly, crumbling under the combined weight of hunger, disease, and filth. The absurdity of all this is that armies still marched with pride, their banners flying, their weapons gleaming, while inside their mouths chaos reigned. Chroniclers praised their bravery in battle, but rarely mentioned the soldiers clutching their jaws in agony at night, unable to sleep, praying for relief. The silence around dental pain reveals how normalized it was. Just as lice, fleas, and hunger were accepted as part of war, so too was the certainty that your teeth would fail long before your sword arm did. You picture the march through rain and mud, soldiers chewing stale bread, spitting blood into the dirt, their jaws swollen, their gums inflamed. Each crunch is a gamble, each bite a threat. By the time they reach the battlefield, many are already broken from within, their strength sapped by jaws too weak to support them. War destroys bodies openly, but it also corrodes them silently, beginning in the mouth. The army camp, the march, and the battlefield all reveal the same truth. Dentistry was never separate from war. It was woven into the rations, the disease, the punishment, and the improvisation. Soldiers fought not only against enemies, but against their own jaws, carrying pain as faithfully as they carried weapons. And when the campaigns ended, when soldiers limped home to villages and towns, they carried their ruined mouths with them. Some returned with jaws shattered by blows, others with gums ravaged by scurvy, still others with gaps where teeth had been ripped out in ditches. Their mouths were the true memoirs of war, recording every hunger, every march, every blow. Yet while armies revealed the brutality of military dentistry, another battlefield lay much closer to home. In monasteries and convents, where monks copied texts and lived lives of devotion, dentistry took on new forms. The quiet cloisters offered different remedies, shaped by prayer, discipline, and strange mixtures brewed in apothecaries. The monks may not have marched to war, but their mouths suffered all the same, and their solutions were as unique as the chants that filled their halls. And if your teeth are still in your head after this story, congratulations, you're already ahead of half the Middle Ages. Let me know down in the comments what kind of historical suffering you want to hear about next, because believe me, there's no shortage of it. And if you enjoyed tonight's dental disaster, make sure to check out my other videos. They're packed with just as much agony, absurdity, and oddly relaxing history.